Good evening and welcome. Tonight, let us slow things down, take a deep breath, and step quietly into a world that feels familiar, yet strangely upside down. A world without screens, without notifications, without endless choices at the tap of a finger. Tonight, we are traveling back to Victorian England, not to admire its inventions or grand architecture, but to answer a deceptively simple question. What did people do for fun? At first glance, the Victorian era looks polished and restrained. Stiff collars, perfect posture, polite smiles. It is easy to imagine that leisure back then was elegant and serene, gentle garden walks, refined music, tasteful conversation over tea. But the truth is far more complicated. Victorian fun was rarely about comfort, relaxation, or personal pleasure. More often, it was about endurance, appearances, and surviving social expectations without embarrassing yourself or your family. In the modern world, fun is usually effortless. You relax because you want to. You stop when you are tired. Entertainment bends to your schedule and your mood. But for Victorians, leisure was not an escape from pressure, it was often another arena where pressure intensified. Free time did not mean freedom. It meant performance. Victorian society placed enormous value on self-control. Showing too much excitement was suspicious. Laughing too loudly was impolite. Expressing strong emotion, even happiness, could be seen as a lack of discipline. So when people gathered to enjoy themselves, they did so under an invisible but very real set of rules. You were expected to participate enthusiastically, but not too enthusiastically. To appear relaxed, while remaining perfectly controlled. To have fun, without ever looking like fun mattered to you too much. This tension shaped nearly every form of Victorian entertainment. Leisure was not designed to be easy or soothing. It was often physically uncomfortable, emotionally demanding, and socially risky. A picnic was not a break from routine, it was a logistical challenge. A game was not just a game, it was a test of manners, memory, and restraint. Even a casual gathering could feel like an exam where the stakes were your reputation. Part of this came from the era's obsession with respectability. Your behavior in public and even in private social settings reflected not just on you, but on your entire family. One careless comment, one awkward moment, one breach of etiquette could be remembered for years. Fun, therefore, had consequences. And everyone knew it. Another factor was the lack of modern comforts. Leisure did not happen in climate-controlled rooms with ergonomic furniture. It happened in stiff clothing, heavy fabrics, and poorly heated or over-ventilated spaces. Many activities required standing for long periods, carrying heavy items, or enduring weather that modern people would simply avoid. Discomfort was normalized. Complaining about it was not. Yet, despite or perhaps because of these constraints, Victorians threw themselves into leisure with remarkable intensity. They committed fully. If an activity was planned, it happened no matter how inconvenient or exhausting it became. Canceling due to discomfort was not just frowned upon, it was seen as weak character. In this way, Victorian fun often resembled a shared ordeal. People bonded not through ease, but through mutual endurance. Surviving an afternoon together, navigating awkward conversations, enduring long events without visible fatigue, these experiences created stories, connections, and social currency. The real reward was not the moment itself, but the ability to later say, "Do you remember when?" This is where Victorian leisure becomes fascinating. Fun was not about pleasure in the moment. It was about memory, narrative, and social proof. If an experience could later be retold at tea, referenced in conversation, or laughed about in hindsight, then it was considered a success even if it was deeply unpleasant at the time. There is also a quiet irony here. Victorians were living through rapid change. Industrialization was reshaping cities, work, and daily life. Technology was advancing at a dizzying pace. Yet, emotionally and socially, people clung to rigid traditions. Leisure became a place where old rules were enforced most strictly, perhaps as a way to maintain control in a world that felt increasingly unpredictable. So when we talk about Victorian fun, we are not really talking about amusement in the modern sense. We are talking about rituals. Carefully choreographed social performances where everyone knew their role, even if no one admitted how exhausting it all was. The activities themselves mattered less than how you conducted yourself during them. Did you show patience, grace, restraint? Could you endure boredom without complaint? Could you laugh softly, sit still, and say the right thing at the right moment? These were the real measures of success. And yet despite all this there was joy. Not loud, explosive joy, but something quieter. A shared smile after an awkward moment passed. A glance exchanged when everyone realized how ridiculous the situation had become. Small rebellions hidden inside acceptable behavior. These subtle moments were where genuine enjoyment lived. Victorians were not humorless. They were observant. They noticed the absurdity of their own customs, even if they rarely acknowledged it openly. Much of their entertainment was laced with irony, satire, and understated wit. The fun was often in what was implied rather than what was said. Understanding this changes how we see everything that follows. Picnics, games, sports, holidays, parties, none of them were simple pastimes. They were stages where people practiced the art of appearing composed while navigating chaos, discomfort, and social danger. So as we move deeper into the world of Victorian leisure, keep this in mind. When Victorians said they were going out to enjoy themselves, they did not mean they expected comfort or ease. They meant they were ready to endure together, to perform respectability, and to come home with a story worth telling. And in the Victorian world, that was fun enough. When we imagine a picnic today, we think of simplicity. A light blanket, a basket, maybe some music, a few hours of relaxed conversation under open skies. It feels casual, spontaneous, even restorative. But for Victorians, a picnic was none of these things. It was not an escape from effort, it was a carefully planned operation that demanded physical strength, social discipline, and a surprising tolerance for discomfort. In Victorian society, a picnic was not just a meal outdoors. It was a public display of refinement, transported wholesale into fields, parks, or countryside estates that were often ill-suited for such elegance. Everything that defined proper domestic life, order, presentation, formality, had to be recreated outdoors, no matter how impractical that might be. Preparation alone was exhausting. A Victorian picnic required an astonishing amount of equipment. Heavy wicker baskets filled with multiple courses of food. Porcelain plates and teacups, because using anything too simple would suggest poor taste. Metal cutlery wrapped carefully in cloth. Glass bottles, folded linens, rugs thick enough to protect clothing from dirt, and sometimes even collapsible tables or chairs. Nothing was allowed to look improvised. All of this had to be transported, often by hand or carriage, over uneven ground. And once everything arrived, the real work began. Setting up the picnic was an event in itself. Cloths had to be laid just right. Food arranged attractively. Tea prepared with the same care it would receive indoors. The goal was to pretend convincingly that nature posed no inconvenience at all. But nature, of course, disagreed. Wind lifted napkins and skirts. Insects hovered persistently. Grass stained clothing. Sudden changes in weather could turn an elegant scene into chaos within minutes. Yet reacting openly to these problems was discouraged. Complaining about discomfort was considered ungraceful. The ideal picnic guest acknowledged nothing and endured everything with quiet composure. Clothing made this even harder. Victorian fashion was not designed for sitting on the ground. Long skirts, tight bodices, layered fabrics, and restrictive footwear turned even simple movements into challenges. Standing up, sitting down, reaching for food, each action required careful negotiation to maintain dignity. A picnic was physically tiring long before the food was served. And then there was the food itself. Victorian picnics favored abundance over practicality. Cold meats, pies, pastries, cheeses, cakes, often far more than anyone could comfortably eat outdoors. Keeping food fresh was difficult. Flies were a constant concern. Yet everything had to be consumed politely, without drawing attention to inconvenience. Conversation, too, followed strict rules. Picnics were social events, often involving extended families or mixed company. Topics had to remain light, pleasant, and non-confrontational. Silence was awkward, but speaking too freely could be risky. Every comment carried the weight of being remembered and repeated later. In this environment, picnics became subtle social tests. How well did you manage discomfort? Did you help without being asked, but not so much that it seemed improper? Could you balance friendliness with restraint? Observers noticed everything. A picnic might last only a few hours, but impressions formed there could last for years. There was also an unspoken competitive element. Hosts wanted their picnic to be remembered as successful. Guests compared arrangements, food quality, locations, and behavior. A poorly organized picnic reflected badly on everyone involved. So people pushed themselves to meet expectations, even when those expectations bordered on the unreasonable. Interestingly, many Victorian diaries and letters describe picnics with a tone that feels strangely familiar to modern readers. Beneath polite phrasing, there are hints of exhaustion, irritation, and relief when the day finally ended. Yet these same accounts often describe the picnic as most enjoyable. This contradiction tells us everything. Enjoyment, in the Victorian sense, did not mean comfort or ease. It meant that the event had unfolded according to social rules. That nothing truly embarrassing had happened. That everyone had endured together and emerged intact. The satisfaction came afterward, not during. In hindsight, picnics became stories. The unexpected rain shower. The runaway napkin. The long walk back home with aching feet. These moments, stripped of immediate discomfort, transformed into shared memories. Retelling them allowed people to laugh quietly at what they could not openly acknowledge at the time. Picnics also served a deeper purpose. They reinforced the idea that refinement was not dependent on environment. A truly respectable person could remain composed anywhere. Mud, insects, and weather were not excuses. Self-control was the ultimate marker of class. And so, the Victorian picnic stands as a perfect example of how leisure functioned in that era. What appears charming and relaxed from a distance was, in reality, a carefully managed ordeal. It demanded planning, endurance, and emotional restraint. The outdoors did not soften Victorian society, it challenged it, and people rose to that challenge because they believed they must. To modern eyes, this might seem unnecessary, even absurd. Why bring fragile porcelain into a field? Why dress formally to eat on the grass? But for Victorians, the point was never ease. The point was proving that civility could survive anywhere, even when comfort could not. And that, in their world, was the very definition of a successful picnic. In today's world, we see toys as sources of fun, imagination, and comfort. A child's playtime is supposed to be a break from instruction, a chance to explore freely. But in the Victorian era, toys were rarely about fun in the modern sense. They were tools of moral, intellectual, and social education. Each plaything carried a lesson, and each lesson often came with strict rules or consequences. Toys for boys and girls were sharply divided by gender. Boys received tools, construction sets, mechanical models, and games that encouraged problem-solving, precision, and practical skill. Girls, on the other hand, were given dolls, miniature household objects, and embroidery kits designed to instill domesticity, order, and moral responsibility. Every object was symbolic. A wooden train was not just a toy. It taught planning, diligence, and the logic of sequences. A porcelain doll was not merely cute. It instructed a girl on caregiving, patience, and presentation. Even the most fun toys were governed by strict rules. Games like hoops, marbles, or educational card sets had codified ways to play. Deviating from these rules was frowned upon and often corrected with public admonishment or parental rebuke. Failure to follow instructions was framed not just as misbehavior but as a moral shortcoming, a reflection of the child's discipline and character. The line between play and instruction was almost invisible. Punishment could be literal. Some toys incorporated corrective measures. Letter writing sets came with manuals, emphasizing proper handwriting. Failure to comply invited scolding. Board games were designed to reward correct knowledge or moral decisions and penalize errors, reinforcing the idea that mistakes had consequences even in play. The Victorian child was constantly learning that the world had rules, and those rules must be respected, whether one was playing or working. Interestingly, children internalized these lessons. Diaries, letters, and memoirs from the era reveal a mix of affection and dread toward toys. Some children loved their dolls and puzzles passionately, while also expressing anxiety about doing things wrong or disappointing authority figures. Play was never fully free. Imagination existed within boundaries. A game was enjoyable only if it maintained decorum and adhered to social expectations. Toys also reflected class. Wealthier children had access to exquisitely crafted objects, miniature pianos, elaborate dollhouses, and mechanical automata that demonstrated taste, status, and refinement. Poorer children, meanwhile, often had simpler wooden toys, rags, or self-made objects, but these were still imbued with instructional purpose. Playtime was an arena for socialization, training, and moral development across all economic levels, albeit with differences in resources and sophistication. Even when toys encouraged creativity, the environment emphasized observation and imitation over invention. Girls learned to sew by replicating patterns. Boys built models by following schematics. Originality was often secondary to accuracy and precision. The ultimate goal was to prepare children for adult roles where obedience, skill, and propriety were paramount. Many historians argue that Victorian toys were a reflection of wider societal values. The era prized self-discipline, respect for hierarchy, and moral uprightness. Leisure and pleasure existed, but always subordinated to education and social expectation. Children were expected to internalize these values early. Play was an extension of schooling and domestic training, a rehearsal for adult life in miniature form. Yet despite or perhaps because of these constraints, Victorian children did find ways to experience joy. Small victories in completing a puzzle, successfully managing a doll's wardrobe, or mastering a complicated mechanical toy offered private satisfaction. Friends and siblings became collaborators, rivals, or teachers. Even within rigid boundaries, imagination could flourish in subtle, personal ways. In retrospect, these toys illuminate a society obsessed with preparation and propriety. The innocence of childhood was never entirely carefree. It was intertwined with duty, expectation, and the cultivation of character. Modern observers often marvel at how much children endured in the name of education, and yet, these toys were celebrated for shaping competent, moral, and refined adults. Play was serious business. Through the lens of toys, we see how deeply Victorian values penetrated everyday life. Every object, every interaction, every moment of leisure carried a lesson. Childhood was a carefully monitored stage, designed not only to entertain but to instruct, correct, and mold. And in understanding this, we glimpse the complexities of a society where even joy was a form of discipline. As we move deeper into the Victorian world, one of the most striking aspects we encounter is their obsession with cleanliness, hygiene, and health. Today, it might sound familiar to us hand-washing, bathing, and sanitary precautions, but in the 19th century, these practices were extreme, sometimes bizarre, and often deeply intertwined with morality and social status. Victorian society did not see dirt and germs merely as a physical problem. They were considered moral failings, indicators of character, and even spiritual contamination. Hygiene became a symbol of virtue. The wealthy demonstrated their refinement through meticulous personal care, elaborate bathing rituals, and immaculately clean homes. Bathrooms, when present, were luxurious spaces often lined with polished fixtures and scented soaps. Daily washing was not just about removing grime. It was a statement. A clean body reflected a disciplined mind and a respectable life. Meanwhile, failure to maintain cleanliness, whether from laziness, ignorance, or poverty, was associated with immorality, laziness, and even disease. For children, the standards were just as rigorous. Bathing was not optional. It was a moral obligation. Parents instructed kids on proper washing techniques, not merely for health but as a lesson in obedience and personal responsibility. Toys, clothing, and even play areas were expected to be clean. Imagine a child being scolded for a muddied sleeve or a dusty playroom. Such infractions were not simply inconveniences. They were moral transgressions. Public hygiene, or the lack thereof, sparked national anxiety. Victorian cities grew rapidly due to industrialization, but sanitation lagged behind. Streets were often filled with waste, sewage, and the byproducts of horse-drawn transport. Cholera, typhoid, and tuberculosis outbreaks terrified the population. This led to the birth of early public health campaigns, which often blended scientific reasoning with moral judgment. Posters and pamphlets exhorted citizens to wash their hands, scrub their homes, and purify their drinking water. Failure to comply was seen as not only a health risk but a moral lapse, a failure to fulfill one's duty to society. The obsession extended to diet as well. Victorians believed that proper nutrition was essential for maintaining both physical and moral health. Meals were highly regulated in terms of content, portion, and timing. Overeating, indulgence in sweets, or consuming unwholesome foods was considered a vice. Children were encouraged to eat everything on their plate, and those who did not were sometimes shamed or disciplined. Illnesses were often interpreted as punishments for gluttony or poor habits, rather than random misfortune. Clothing also reflected these hygiene ideals. Layered, well-pressed garments were not simply fashion statements, they were protective barriers against dirt and disease. Women wore gloves to avoid direct contact with contaminants, while men carried handkerchiefs for similar reasons. Even shoes were carefully maintained, as muddy streets were seen as breeding grounds for both illness and moral decay. Interestingly, these hygiene practices sometimes became extreme to the point of absurdity. Some Victorian parents insisted on frequent cold baths for children, believing exposure to shockingly cold water strengthened the constitution. Toothbrushes and early forms of toothpaste became part of daily routines, long before dental science caught up with understanding cavities and decay. Household cleaning products included mixtures of chemicals that would be considered dangerous today. Yet, these measures were viewed as necessary safeguards for health and virtue. Medical practices of the era reflected the same preoccupations. Doctors prescribed strict regimens of bathing, purging, and controlled diets, often with moralistic undertones. Illness was not merely a biological event, it was a reflection of lifestyle, character, and adherence to societal norms. Women, in particular, faced scrutiny for their hygiene habits, as their role as caretakers extended not only to children but to the moral and physical health of the household. Despite the intensity of these practices, there was also a creative side to Victorian hygiene culture. Bathing rituals could involve fragrant oils, decorated soap dishes, and elaborate tubs. Personal grooming became an art form, combining function with aesthetic pleasure. For children, the act of cleaning could involve scented powders and colorful washcloths, turning routine into ritual. In this way, the obsession with cleanliness fused practicality, social expectation, and sensory enjoyment. However, there was a darker side. The fixation on health and hygiene often amplified social inequalities. Wealthy families could afford pure water, soap, and regular bathing facilities, while the poor were left with contaminated supplies and crowded, unsanitary living conditions. Public health campaigns, while beneficial in principle, sometimes blamed the victims of poverty for their plight, reinforcing class hierarchies and moral judgments. The concept of deserving versus undeserving cleanliness became a subtle but powerful social tool. This preoccupation with hygiene extended even into literature and children's education. Moral stories frequently illustrated the perils of filth and the virtues of cleanliness. Schools emphasized orderly desks, neat clothing, and well-groomed appearances as part of discipline. The connection between personal cleanliness and social responsibility was drilled into children from a very young age, ensuring that these habits would carry into adulthood. Yet, it is important to recognize that these practices also had benefits. The emphasis on sanitation, hand-washing, and public health campaigns helped reduce disease outbreaks and raised awareness about germs long before germ theory became widely accepted. Victorian society's moral framing of cleanliness, while extreme, paved the way for modern hygiene standards. Children who grew up under these rules often developed a strong sense of order, responsibility, and awareness of public health. Ultimately, Victorian obsession with cleanliness and health was about more than hygiene. It reflected the era's values, discipline, morality, social status, and control. Every bath, scrub, and meticulously washed garment was an act of conformity to societal norms. For children, it was another layer of structured education, another arena in which behavior, appearance, and character were constantly monitored. Play, dress, diet, and daily routines were all infused with lessons on personal responsibility, morality, and societal expectation. In understanding this obsession, we gain insight into a world where the boundaries between health, morality, and social propriety were almost indistinguishable. Childhood was not a carefree escape from responsibility. It was a stage for learning, observing, and internalizing the principles of cleanliness, discipline, and virtue. Victorian children grew up in a world where even soap and water carried weighty cultural significance, shaping their identities in ways that extended far beyond physical hygiene. Looking back, it is astonishing to see how deeply these practices penetrated daily life. What seems normal to us now, a hand wash, a bath, a clean outfit, was once a moral and social imperative. In Victorian society, even minor lapses could signify failure in character, while diligence in cleanliness reflected intelligence, virtue, and respectability. Childhood was a structured journey where every action, no matter how small, reinforced the expectations of a rigid and morally conscious society. Through the lens of hygiene and health, we see that the Victorian era was a time when daily routines were more than rituals, they were lessons in morality, discipline, and social hierarchy. These lessons, absorbed through the simple acts of bathing, dressing, and maintaining a clean home, provide a fascinating window into the values, fears, and aspirations of a society obsessed with order, control, and propriety. Even today, their legacy lingers. Our modern focus on hand-washing, sanitizers, and personal care may seem practical, but its roots are entwined with a culture that equated cleanliness with morality, health, and social worth. Understanding this obsession helps us appreciate the complex intersection of health, behavior, and morality in history, and reminds us how deeply societal values can shape even the most mundane aspects of life. As we continue exploring the intricate world of Victorian childhood, today we dive into a fascinating facet, play. But do not picture carefree, unsupervised games in the park as we know them today. Victorian play was heavily structured, closely monitored, and deeply infused with moral and educational intent. Unlike modern times, where play is largely about creativity, relaxation, and socialization, Victorian children's games were designed to instill values, discipline, and social norms, often in surprisingly rigid ways. The Victorian belief in structured play stemmed from a conviction that children were morally malleable. Play was a tool, not just for entertainment, but for shaping character. Board games, outdoor activities, and even dolls were carefully curated to reinforce lessons about honesty, obedience, diligence, and respect for hierarchy. Parents and educators believed that the habits and behaviors learned through play would prepare children for adult life, where virtue, discipline, and social responsibility were paramount. Board games, which became increasingly popular in the 19th century, were rarely frivolous. Games like the Mansion of Happiness or the Game of Life emphasized morality, virtue, and consequences. Players advanced or were penalized based on virtuous or wicked actions within the game. Every turn was a subtle lesson. Behaving rightly leads to rewards, while moral failings result in setbacks. In essence, these games were miniature simulations of society, teaching children to internalize societal expectations long before they faced adult responsibilities. Outdoor games, too, were subject to scrutiny. Activities like hoop rolling, skipping rope, or croquet were not just for fun. They reinforced physical discipline, cooperation, and adherence to rules. Even sports carried a moral dimension. Cricket, for example, was framed as a lesson in fairness, teamwork, and respect for authority. Winning was secondary to observing proper conduct, demonstrating that character and virtue mattered more than mere skill. In this sense, every game was both a physical and ethical exercise. Dolls and toys reflected similar moral priorities. Dollhouses, miniature kitchens, and domestic figurines allowed children, especially girls, to practice household roles, hygiene, and caretaking. Through play, children learned societal expectations, proper manners, order, and responsibility. Boys, conversely, engaged with toys that reflected professions, military endeavors, or civic duty, preparing them to become productive, disciplined members of society. Play was never neutral. It was a reflection of the rigid social structure that Victorian adults sought to pass on. Even imaginative play was guided by morality. Stories told through toys or puppets had clear distinctions between right and wrong. Villains were punished, heroes rewarded, and lessons were explicit. Parents often supervised these activities, ensuring that play reinforced approved values rather than subversive or rebellious ideas. Creativity existed, but within strict moral boundaries. For instance, a child could invent new ways for a character to navigate a challenge, but the outcome had to align with societal notions of justice, hard work, and propriety. Education intersected closely with play. Many Victorian schools incorporated games that taught arithmetic, reading, and social etiquette simultaneously. Spelling bees, counting games, and recitation competitions were both competitive and instructive. They encouraged children to internalize knowledge while learning to follow rules, take turns, and respect authority. Learning was rarely isolated from moral or social lessons. Every lesson had a dual purpose: intellectual growth and character formation. Interestingly, structured play also served to reinforce gender roles. Girls' games and toys emphasized domestic skills, nurturing, and modesty, while boys' activities highlighted strategy, leadership, and public conduct. This division of play reflected broader societal expectations about gender, preparing children to occupy clearly defined adult roles. Play was both training and socialization. It molded not only individuals but the society they would eventually uphold. Yet, the Victorians also recognized the value of imagination within structured limits. Storytelling, puppet shows, and theatrical games allowed children to explore moral dilemmas, empathy, and problem-solving. Imaginative play provided a safe environment to experience consequences, test social rules, and develop reasoning skills. Even fantasy was carefully controlled to ensure that lessons of morality, discipline, and virtue remained central. Class played a role in the types of play children experienced. Wealthy families could afford elaborate games, imported toys, and private outdoor spaces, while working-class children often had to make do with simpler, homemade toys and playgrounds. However, the moral principles underlying play, obedience, responsibility, and virtue remained consistent across social strata. The difference lay in resources, scale, and aesthetic refinement. Discipline and reward were key elements of structured play. Misbehavior during the game was not just disruptive, it was a moral failure. Parents and teachers would intervene, correcting conduct, and emphasizing the importance of fairness, patience, and respect for others. Conversely, praise and rewards reinforced good behavior, teaching children that virtue yielded tangible recognition. This interplay of punishment and reward extended lessons from play into everyday life, ensuring that morality was inseparable from enjoyment and social interaction. Even holidays and festive games were infused with lessons. Christmas celebrations, for instance, often included moralistic gift-giving, where rewards were linked to good behavior throughout the year. Pageants, performances, and community games combined celebration with education, reinforcing societal norms while fostering social cohesion. Through these experiences, children absorbed the message that personal conduct was always observed, evaluated, and consequential. Structured play also reflected the era's anxieties. Victorian adults were deeply concerned about idleness, laziness, and moral corruption. Leisure without guidance was considered dangerous. Structured play, therefore, served as a protective mechanism, channeling energy into constructive and morally instructive activities. Even enjoyment was subordinated to social utility. Fun existed, but it was inseparable from instruction, character formation, and preparation for adult responsibilities. In reflecting on Victorian structured play, we see a complex intersection of fun, morality, education, and social control. Play was a carefully managed environment where children learned rules, tested consequences, and internalized societal expectations. Far from the unstructured free play we celebrate today, Victorian children navigated a world where every game, every toy, and every activity carried lessons about virtue, obedience, and responsibility. Understanding these practices gives us insight into how Victorian society viewed childhood itself. Not merely a time for leisure or innocence, but a formative stage for producing disciplined, moral, and socially responsible adults. Structured play was both a reflection of societal values and a tool for perpetuating them, blending education, entertainment, and moral instruction in ways that left lasting impressions on generations of children. In essence, the Victorian approach to play reveals a society obsessed with order, morality, and social propriety. It reminds us that even the most seemingly mundane activities, rolling a hoop, moving a pawn, or tending a dollhouse, were infused with lessons about how to live rightly. Play was not just play. It was a rehearsal for life, a moral gymnasium where virtues were exercised, and character was honed. As we move deeper into the world of Victorian childhood, today's focus is on a topic that shaped every waking hour of a child's life: discipline. Unlike the relatively flexible approaches to childhood seen today, Victorian children lived under highly structured routines and strict rules, both at home and at school. Discipline was not just about keeping children in line. It was considered essential for forming moral character, cultivating self-control, and preparing them for the responsibilities of adult life. Daily life for a Victorian child was a carefully orchestrated series of tasks and expectations. From the moment they woke up, children were guided by schedules designed to instill order, punctuality, and obedience. Morning routines included washing, dressing, and making beds, each performed with an emphasis on neatness and personal responsibility. These routines were more than hygiene. They were exercises in discipline and self-respect. Every small task was a lesson in diligence, showing children that attention to detail and personal effort were markers of virtue. School life mirrored these principles. Victorian classrooms were structured environments where obedience to authority was paramount. Teachers maintained strict control, and rules governed behavior, seating, and even posture. Punishments for misbehavior could be severe, ranging from public reprimands to corporal punishment, depending on the school. The philosophy behind such strictness was that children needed to experience consequences early and learn to regulate their actions in accordance with social norms. Lessons extended beyond reading, writing, and arithmetic. They included deportment, etiquette, and moral instruction. Discipline extended to social interactions as well. Victorian children were expected to show respect to elders, peers, and authority figures. Politeness, deference, and propriety were constantly reinforced, both in the home and at school. Missteps in manners were taken seriously, often corrected immediately to prevent the formation of bad habits. This focus on etiquette reflected the era's obsession with social hierarchy and the belief that proper conduct was inseparable from moral character. Chores were another key aspect of discipline. Children, particularly in middle and upper-class families, were assigned household responsibilities that reflected their social standing and gender. Girls might be tasked with sewing, cleaning, or assisting with cooking, while boys handled outdoor work or learned practical skills tied to future careers. These chores were not optional. They were seen as essential training for adulthood. Completing them dutifully reinforced lessons in responsibility, perseverance, and the value of labor. Religion also played a central role in enforcing discipline. Victorian society was deeply moralistic, and children's daily routines often included prayer, scripture reading, or religious instruction. Obedience to religious authority was intertwined with obedience to parents and teachers, creating a consistent framework of moral accountability. Children were taught to internalize the idea that their actions had spiritual consequences, reinforcing the connection between self-control, virtue, and lifelong moral responsibility. Discipline was not only about punishment. It also involved reward and recognition. Good behavior was praised, and achievements were celebrated, often publicly. This dual approach, punishment for errors, reward for virtue, helped children understand the consequences of their actions and motivated them to adhere to societal expectations. Even seemingly minor acts, like helping a sibling or completing homework diligently, were opportunities for moral instruction and reinforcement. Health and physical discipline were equally emphasized. Exercise, diet, and sleep were closely monitored, reflecting Victorian concerns about childhood frailty and moral strength. Outdoor play, walking, and structured sports were encouraged not only for physical development but also for building resilience and self-control. Children were expected to endure minor discomforts and adhere to routines that promoted stamina, reinforcing the belief that discipline shaped both body and mind. Interestingly, discipline also extended to emotional development. Victorian parents and educators emphasized restraint, teaching children to control anger, temper tantrums, and impulsive behavior. Emotional self-regulation was considered a critical skill, preparing children to navigate social hierarchies and adult responsibilities. Crying, complaining, or arguing were often discouraged, and children learned to express themselves within socially acceptable bounds. The home environment reinforced these lessons. Parents were expected to maintain authority through consistent rules and expectations. Affection was shown selectively, often contingent upon good behavior, reflecting the belief that moral guidance required firm boundaries. While this might seem harsh by modern standards, it was seen as nurturing in a structured way, ensuring that children internalized discipline as part of their character. Discipline also intersected with education in subtle ways. Beyond academics, children were trained in memory, punctuality, and meticulousness. Copying texts, memorizing poems, and performing recitations were exercises in patience and perseverance. Mistakes were corrected promptly, reinforcing the importance of accuracy and diligence. Learning and discipline were inseparable, teaching children that intellectual and moral development went hand in hand. For working-class children, discipline often had a more pragmatic dimension. Economic necessity meant that children contributed to family labor from an early age. Obedience, reliability, and industriousness were critical not just morally, but practically, for survival. Work routines taught skills and reinforced social hierarchies, preparing children for the adult labor market. Even leisure was constrained, often tied to religious or community events that reinforced discipline and moral instruction. Ultimately, Victorian discipline reflects a worldview in which childhood was not a carefree interlude but a carefully managed stage of preparation. Every waking moment, from chores to study, play to prayer, was an opportunity to cultivate self-control, moral awareness, and social competence. Children were expected to internalize societal rules, developing habits and virtues that would guide them throughout life. This structured approach may seem rigid or extreme today, but it offers valuable insight into how Victorian society understood human development. Discipline was not arbitrary. It was a comprehensive framework designed to shape body, mind, and character simultaneously. It highlights the era's preoccupation with order, moral rectitude, and the belief that the formative years of childhood were critical for producing responsible, virtuous adults. Reflecting on this approach allows us to appreciate both the challenges and the intentions behind Victorian childhood. While modern perspectives may favor freedom, creativity, and play as central to development, understanding the Victorian emphasis on discipline helps explain many of the social behaviors, educational practices, and cultural norms that persisted well into the 20th century. Victorian children were, in essence, the products of a world that sought to mold every action, thought, and emotion into a coherent vision of moral and social excellence. Continuing our journey through the lives of Victorian children, today we turn to one of the most striking and often harsh aspects of childhood in this era: child labor. Unlike the more sheltered and leisurely experiences we might associate with childhood today, many Victorian children, especially those from working-class families, had their formative years shaped not by play or study but by work. Economic necessity dictated the rhythm of their days, and labor was not only a duty but often a matter of survival. In industrial cities like Manchester, Birmingham, and London, children worked in factories, mills, mines, and workshops. The booming Industrial Revolution created immense demand for cheap, agile labor, and children fit that need perfectly. Their small size allowed them to navigate tight spaces in mines, operate delicate machinery, or clean equipment in textile mills. What might seem exploitative to modern eyes was considered a pragmatic solution to the economic realities of the time. Families often relied on the income of their children to make ends meet, and even small wages were crucial for survival. Working conditions were extremely harsh. Long hours, often 12 to 16 hours per day, were the norm, with minimal breaks and little concern for safety. Factory machinery was dangerous, and accidents were common. Mines were dimly lit, cramped, and prone to collapses or flooding. Children suffered from exhaustion, malnutrition, and various illnesses caused by exposure to dust, chemicals, or poor ventilation. Despite these conditions, Victorian society largely accepted child labor as a necessary evil, reflecting the era's belief in work as a formative moral force. Education and labor were often in conflict. While middle and upper-class children might spend years in structured schooling, working-class children frequently had to balance school with work or abandon education entirely. Some attended half-time schools, which allowed them to work part of the day and study for the rest. Others were entirely excluded from formal education, learning instead through apprenticeships or on-the-job experience. This created a stark social divide, where wealth and class determined access to learning and leisure, shaping life trajectories from an early age. Child labor also reflected broader social and moral philosophies. Many Victorians believed that work instilled discipline, character, and resilience. It was thought that exposure to responsibility and hardship prepared children for the challenges of adult life. Religious and moral teachings reinforced this view, portraying labor as virtuous and idleness as dangerous. Families and employers alike justified children's work as a necessary preparation for their eventual roles as contributing members of society. However, not all work was industrial or mechanical. Domestic labor was another critical component of Victorian childhood. Many girls, in particular, were employed as domestic servants, either within their own homes or in wealthier households. Duties included cooking, cleaning, laundering, and caring for younger children. While this work was often less dangerous than factory labor, it came with its own set of hardships, long hours, strict supervision, and little personal freedom. Even within the domestic sphere, children were expected to demonstrate reliability, obedience, and competence from an early age. The labor of children also extended into the streets. Selling newspapers, running errands, or performing small trades were common ways for children to contribute economically. These street occupations were often precarious, exposing children to crime, exploitation, and injury. Yet, for many families, every penny earned mattered. Victorian society largely tolerated or ignored these risks, focusing instead on the perceived benefits of instilling industrious habits and self-reliance. Reform movements began to emerge in response to the harsh realities of child labor. Activists, writers, and politicians increasingly raised awareness about the physical and moral costs of such work. Laws were introduced gradually to regulate hours, set minimum age limits, and require basic education. The Factory Acts, beginning in the early 19th century, sought to limit child labor in factories, while subsequent legislation addressed mines and other industries. While enforcement was often inconsistent, these laws reflected growing concern for the welfare and development of children. Despite these reforms, the tension between economic necessity and childhood welfare persisted throughout the Victorian era. Children's contributions to family income were indispensable, and even as laws improved working conditions, many children continued to work long hours. The economic realities of poverty often outweighed idealistic notions of a carefree childhood. As a result, Victorian childhood was deeply intertwined with labor, and the lines between play, learning, and work were frequently blurred. This focus on child labor also shaped cultural attitudes. Literature, newspapers, and social commentary often highlighted the plight of working children, eliciting public sympathy and debate. Writers like Charles Dickens vividly portrayed the struggles of child laborers, bringing attention to the social inequities and human costs of industrialization. These narratives helped shift public consciousness, laying the groundwork for future reforms and the eventual conception of childhood as a protected, distinct stage of life. In essence, child labor in Victorian England was both a necessity and a moral lesson. It reinforced the values of hard work, resilience, and obedience while exposing the vulnerabilities of children to exploitation and harm. Understanding this reality allows us to appreciate the complex interplay between economic, social, and moral forces in shaping childhood. Victorian children were not merely passive victims of circumstance. They were active participants in a system that demanded endurance, responsibility, and adaptability from a very young age. Reflecting on this aspect of Victorian childhood provides a powerful lens for considering how economic pressures, social norms, and moral philosophies intersected to define the experiences of young people. It also underscores the dramatic changes in our own views of childhood, labor, and education over the past 2 centuries. By exploring the realities of child labor, we gain a deeper understanding of the resilience, ingenuity, and humanity of children navigating an era defined by industrial transformation, social hierarchy, and relentless expectations. Now that we have explored the serious and often harsh realities of work for Victorian children, it is time to shift our focus to a lighter, more playful side of childhood, play and recreation. Despite the rigid social structures, long work hours, and limited freedoms that defined much of Victorian life, children still found ways to laugh, imagine, and create their own worlds of fun. Understanding how they played offers a window into the resilience, creativity, and cultural values of the era. Play in Victorian childhood was both structured and spontaneous. For children of the middle and upper classes, leisure activities were often guided by adults and designed to instill moral or social lessons. Board games, puzzles, and educational toys were popular, reflecting the belief that play should cultivate intellect, virtue, and etiquette. Dolls, miniature houses, and toy soldiers provided avenues for imaginative storytelling while also subtly reinforcing societal expectations of gender roles and domestic responsibilities. Girls might play with dolls or sewing sets, practicing care and domesticity, while boys were encouraged to strategize with building blocks, toy armies, or mechanical toys that mirrored adult work and military life. For working-class children, play often had to fit around work and household duties, but that did not stop them from finding inventive ways to enjoy themselves. Streets, alleyways, and public squares became playgrounds where children played games that required little to no equipment. Skipping ropes, hoops, marbles, and simple ball games were staples of outdoor play. Folk games like blindman's buff, hopscotch, and tag were not only sources of joy but also encouraged physical agility, coordination, and social interaction. Even in crowded urban areas, children carved out spaces for play, often forming elaborate games with their friends that mimicked adult life or fantastical adventures. Seasonal and community events also played a significant role in children's recreation. Fairs, holidays, and church festivities offered rare moments of respite from daily routines. These occasions were filled with music, dancing, contests, and games, giving children opportunities to engage with their peers and the wider community. Such events were crucial for social development, teaching children about cooperation, competition, and the shared joy of communal experiences. Imagination was a central element of Victorian play. Storytelling, role-playing, and make-believe allowed children to explore worlds beyond their immediate environment. Tales from fairy books, adventure novels, and serialized stories in newspapers and magazines fueled their creativity. Children might act out scenes from popular stories, create their own characters, or invent entirely new narratives. This imaginative play was not just entertainment, it was a tool for learning, self-expression, and emotional development. Victorian attitudes toward play were deeply influenced by contemporary moral and educational philosophies. Play was often seen as a vehicle for teaching discipline, cooperation, and social norms. Educators and parents encouraged games that developed skills deemed useful for adulthood, such as problem-solving, strategic thinking, and manual dexterity. At the same time, excessive or frivolous play was discouraged, particularly for working-class children whose labor was considered essential. This tension between work and play defined much of childhood experience in the era. Outdoor play also connected children to nature and physical exercise, which were increasingly valued for health and moral reasons. The Victorian era saw the rise of parks, playgrounds, and organized sports, reflecting a growing recognition of the benefits of physical activity. Children were encouraged to run, climb, and explore, promoting not only fitness but also independence, courage, and resilience. Organized sports like cricket, football, and swimming became more popular, particularly among middle and upper-class children, while working-class children often improvised their own games in streets and open spaces. Education and recreation were intertwined in Victorian thought. Reading, music, and art were considered important aspects of play, especially for girls, who might be taught to play the piano, paint, or practice calligraphy as both leisure and preparation for adult responsibilities. Boys, similarly, might engage in constructive hobbies, such as model building, science experiments, or outdoor exploration, blending enjoyment with skill development. Play was thus a reflection of social values, preparing children for their expected roles while still allowing room for joy and creativity. Despite societal restrictions and expectations, children's ingenuity in creating games and activities was remarkable. They transformed everyday objects into toys, invented rules for street games, and found adventure in ordinary surroundings. For example, sticks became swords, hoops turned into races, and cardboard boxes were castles. This resourcefulness speaks to the universal human drive for play, and the resilience of childhood imagination, even in challenging circumstances. Cultural influences also shaped recreational trends. Literature, theater, and emerging media influenced the types of games children played. Characters from books or stage productions became the inspiration for role-playing and make-believe. Dolls, puppets, and early mechanical toys were often modeled after popular figures, blending entertainment with cultural literacy. Story-driven play reinforced narratives and values admired by society, offering children a bridge between imagination and the real world. Importantly, play also served as a coping mechanism. For working-class children, who often faced exhausting labor and limited freedoms, moments of recreation were a respite from harsh realities. Play allowed children to assert agency, form social bonds, and experience joy in an otherwise constrained environment. Even brief periods of laughter, imaginative engagement, or friendly competition were vital for emotional well-being. Victorian play and recreation were thus a complex mixture of creativity, morality, education, and survival. They reflected social hierarchies, gender expectations, and cultural ideals, while simultaneously providing space for imagination, expression, and camaraderie. The interplay of structured and spontaneous play, outdoor and indoor activities, and imaginative and practical pursuits shaped the social and emotional development of children in profound ways. In sum, exploring the recreational lives of Victorian children gives us a fuller, richer understanding of their world. Despite constraints of class, labor, and societal expectations, children found ways to play, to imagine, and to explore. Their ingenuity and resilience remind us that play is not merely a luxury, it is an essential part of growing up, learning, and connecting with others. By appreciating the ways Victorian children created joy in their lives, we can gain insight into both the challenges and the triumphs of childhood in an era so different from our own. After exploring how Victorian children found joy and adventure through play and recreation, it is time to look at another central aspect of their lives, education. School in the Victorian era was a world of strict rules, moral instruction, and limited freedoms, yet it played a pivotal role in shaping children's futures, social identities, and daily experiences. Understanding Victorian education helps us grasp the pressures, expectations, and opportunities that influenced the lives of millions of children during this transformative period. Education in Victorian England was deeply stratified by class. Middle and upper-class children had access to private schools or tutors, while working-class children often attended charity schools, ragged schools, or local parish schools. The quality, curriculum, and atmosphere of these institutions varied widely, reflecting societal inequalities and regional differences. For many working-class children, education was limited and secondary to labor responsibilities. Attendance could be irregular, as children were often needed at home or in factories, yet the growing recognition of literacy and numeracy as essential skills slowly increased access to schooling. The Victorian school day was rigorous and highly structured. Children sat in rows, often for hours, under the watchful eyes of strict teachers. Discipline was enforced through corporal punishment, verbal reprimands, and a strict adherence to rules of behavior and decorum. Lessons emphasized memorization, repetition, and recitation, reflecting a belief that mental discipline was just as important as moral instruction. Subjects included reading, writing, arithmetic, history, geography, and religious education, with moral lessons integrated into nearly every activity. Children were taught not only facts but also values, obedience, industriousness, respect for authority, and proper conduct. Classroom experiences varied by age and gender. Boys and girls were often separated, and the curriculum for each reflected societal expectations. Girls were taught domestic skills, manners, and arts like music and embroidery, preparing them for future roles as wives and mothers. Boys were educated in more academically rigorous subjects, sometimes including sciences, technical skills, or preparation for professional careers. However, even among boys, educational quality depended on social class. Many working-class boys received only basic literacy and numeracy, leaving them unprepared for higher education or upward mobility. Teachers were central figures in Victorian schools, wielding significant authority over their students. They were expected to instill discipline, morality, and knowledge, sometimes with little support or training. The relationship between teacher and pupil was often formal and hierarchical, with limited opportunities for dialogue or individual expression. Punishments for misbehavior could be severe, including the use of the cane, writing lines, or standing for long periods, reflecting societal beliefs in the necessity of strict guidance to shape character and behavior. Despite these strictures, school life offered children opportunities for socialization, competition, and intellectual growth. Classmates became peers, friends, and rivals, forming networks that could last a lifetime. Activities like reading aloud, group exercises, and debates encouraged collaboration and confidence. School events such as prize days, recitals, and exhibitions allowed children to showcase their achievements and receive recognition from teachers, peers, and parents. For many, these moments were highlights of the school year, blending accomplishment, pride, and social validation. Victorian education was also influenced by moral and religious ideologies. Sunday schools, for instance, emphasized literacy alongside Christian teachings, aiming to cultivate piety and moral responsibility. Even secular schools often reinforced ethical behavior, teaching children lessons about honesty, hard work, and obedience. The goal was not only to impart knowledge but to mold character, preparing children to navigate the demands of adult life in a structured, hierarchical society. Recess and breaks provided rare moments of freedom, echoing the importance of play in children's development. Outdoor time allowed students to stretch, interact informally, and burn off energy, though these periods were often short and strictly supervised. Games, sports, and physical exercises were sometimes integrated into the curriculum, reflecting a growing awareness of the connection between health, discipline, and moral character. Schools began to recognize that physical activity complemented mental education, and organized sports slowly became part of school culture, especially for middle and upper-class boys. Educational reforms gradually transformed the landscape of Victorian schooling. The Education Act of 1870, for example, marked a turning point by making elementary education compulsory for children aged 5 to 12 in England and Wales. This legislation reflected a societal acknowledgement that literacy and basic education were crucial for social progress, economic development, and civic participation. Over time, reforms improved access, standardized curricula, and raised expectations, though inequalities persisted, and working-class children often continued to face significant obstacles. Despite challenges, Victorian school life was formative in shaping identity, skills, and aspirations. For children, it was a space where they learned not only facts but also societal norms, ethical principles, and social interaction. It could be intimidating, exhausting, and rigid, yet it also offered opportunities for achievement, recognition, and personal growth. The lessons learned in these classrooms, both academic and moral, had a lasting impact, influencing children's adult lives and the society in which they would participate. In conclusion, Victorian education and school life reveal a world of contrasts, strict discipline and structured learning paired with moments of social connection, intellectual discovery, and personal accomplishment. Understanding this aspect of childhood provides insight into the broader cultural values, social hierarchies, and challenges of the era. For modern audiences, it is a reminder of the complex interplay between education, morality, and opportunity, showing how childhood experiences have long-lasting consequences on development, resilience, and identity. As we move forward in our journey through Victorian childhood, it is impossible to ignore a reality that profoundly shaped children's lives, health, and illness. The Victorian era, spanning from 1837 to 1901, was a time of rapid industrialization, urban growth, and social transformation, but it was also a period marked by widespread disease, limited medical knowledge, and high child mortality. Understanding the health challenges of Victorian children gives us crucial insight into the daily struggles, fears, and resilience of young lives during this era. In Victorian cities, crowded and unsanitary living conditions contributed to the prevalence of infectious diseases. Cholera, typhoid, tuberculosis, scarlet fever, and smallpox were common threats, particularly in working-class neighborhoods. Poor housing, inadequate sewage systems, contaminated water, and overcrowded streets made children highly vulnerable. Even middle-class families, while generally living in cleaner homes, were not immune to epidemics, as diseases could travel quickly through schools and communities. Public health infrastructure was still developing, and medical interventions were limited, leaving prevention as one of the few lines of defense. Nutrition played a critical role in children's health. Many working-class families struggled to provide enough food, and malnutrition weakened immunity, making children more susceptible to disease. Bread, potatoes, and cheap meats were dietary staples, but fresh vegetables, fruits, and dairy were often scarce. In contrast, middle and upper-class children had better access to varied and nutritious diets, although even they faced health risks from overfeeding, sedentary lifestyles, and lack of exposure to natural elements. The disparities in nutrition mirrored the broader class inequalities in Victorian society, shaping health outcomes from an early age. Medical care for children was rudimentary and often frightening. Doctors were few and expensive, while home remedies, folk treatments, and patent medicines were common. Vaccination, particularly against smallpox, was available but sometimes controversial, and public health campaigns were in their infancy. Children undergoing treatment for illness often experienced painful procedures, untested medications, or long periods of isolation. Despite these challenges, the era saw early efforts to improve pediatric care, with hospitals beginning to specialize in children and public health initiatives gradually raising awareness about sanitation and disease prevention. Child mortality rates were alarmingly high. It was not uncommon for families to lose one or more children to preventable illnesses. Parents lived with constant anxiety, and children often grew up acutely aware of the fragility of life. This environment of uncertainty influenced social behaviors. Family structures and emotional development. Victorian children learned resilience early, often caring for sick siblings or adapting quickly to the absence of friends who fell ill. Communities formed informal support networks, sharing knowledge about remedies, home care, and local physicians. School attendance and health were closely linked. Frequent illness meant that children, particularly in working-class families, often missed days or weeks of schooling. Epidemics could close schools for extended periods, disrupting learning and social interaction. Teachers and administrators recognized the importance of hygiene, but knowledge about germs and disease transmission was limited. Practices such as hand washing, ventilation, and personal cleanliness were encouraged, reflecting growing but incomplete understanding of public health. Childhood illnesses also shaped culture, literature, and domestic life. Stories, poems, and plays of the era often referenced fragile health, the courage of sick children, or the societal impact of disease. Families prepared for sickness with remedies and care routines, and children internalized these narratives, blending fear with fascination. Bedside storytelling, quiet games, and home instruction became necessary during periods of illness, creating spaces for imagination, reflection, and learning beyond the formal classroom. Vaccinations, sanitation reforms, and medical discoveries gradually improved outcomes toward the end of the Victorian era. Public health acts introduced cleaner water, better sewage management, and regulations for housing. Pediatric medicine began to advance, focusing on prevention, proper nutrition, and specialized care. While challenges persisted, these developments marked the beginning of a shift toward healthier childhoods, setting the stage for modern understanding of children's welfare. Despite the hardships, Victorian children displayed remarkable resilience. Illness and poor health shaped character, social bonds, and family life, teaching adaptability and empathy. Communities, schools, and families responded creatively to health challenges, blending traditional knowledge with emerging scientific insights. Children learned to navigate uncertainty, developing a sense of agency and understanding of the world's unpredictability, lessons that, in many ways, resonate even today. In conclusion, childhood health in the Victorian era was a complex interplay of environment, nutrition, medical knowledge, and societal norms. Disease, malnutrition, and limited care created real threats, but they also fostered resilience, community solidarity, and the beginnings of systemic change in public health. By exploring this facet of Victorian life, we gain a deeper appreciation for the courage, creativity, and adaptability of children growing up in a world that was both advancing and perilous, where survival often depended on family, community, and the small victories of daily care. As we continue exploring the lives of Victorian children, today we turn to an aspect that profoundly shaped their experiences, work, and labor. While we often imagine childhood as a carefree time of play and learning, for many children during the Victorian era, work was a central, inescapable part of daily life. Economic pressures, social expectations, and the rapid growth of industry meant that childhood labor was common, and it left lasting marks on both individual lives and society at large. The Industrial Revolution transformed the economic landscape of Victorian Britain, creating new opportunities and new demands for child labor. Factories, mines, workshops, and domestic service all relied heavily on children. Families, particularly in working-class neighborhoods, often depended on the income that children could contribute. A boy of 8 might work long hours in a textile mill, running between looms to repair threads, while a girl of 10 could serve as a domestic helper, performing endless chores in someone else's household. Even outside the cities, children in rural areas worked on farms, tending animals, harvesting crops, or assisting in family-run trades. Industrial work was often grueling, dangerous, and exhausting. In factories, children faced long shifts, sometimes 12 hours or more under harsh supervision. Machinery posed serious hazards. Fingers, hands, and even limbs could be injured or lost. Mines were even more perilous, with low ceilings, collapsing tunnels, and poisonous gases creating constant threats. Despite these risks, employers favored children because they were cheap, manageable, and less likely to protest poor conditions. Safety regulations were minimal, and although reforms slowly emerged, enforcement was inconsistent, leaving many children vulnerable to injury and exploitation. Child labor was also highly structured by social class and gender. Boys often undertook heavy or technical work, such as in mines, factories, or apprenticeships in trades. Girls' labor typically involved domestic service, textile work, or caregiving roles. While the experiences differed, both genders faced early responsibility, discipline, and limited leisure. Play existed, but it was often confined to brief periods, sometimes squeezed into early mornings, evenings, or Sundays. Childhood, for many, was inseparable from work. Education and labor were intertwined in complex ways. Poor families often prioritized immediate income over schooling, and even when schools were available, attendance could be irregular. Factories and workshops sometimes offered rudimentary instruction, but literacy and numeracy were not always guaranteed. Reformers recognized the problem, arguing that education should supplement or eventually replace child labor, but economic necessity often dictated otherwise. The Factory Acts, gradually introduced in the 19th century, sought to limit hours and improve conditions for children, but progress was slow and uneven. Beyond survival, child labor had profound psychological and social effects. Early exposure to responsibility and harsh environments shaped resilience, self-reliance, and practical skills, but it also curtailed freedom, play, and personal development. Children in demanding labor often developed strong work ethics and resourcefulness, yet they faced exhaustion, stress, and a heightened awareness of societal inequalities. For many, childhood labor left scars physical, emotional, and sometimes lifelong, but it also fostered solidarity among peers, as children navigated shared challenges together. Domestic service was another common avenue for childhood work, particularly for girls. These roles required early mastery of household skills: cooking, cleaning, laundry, childcare, and demanded obedience and discretion. Girls working in service were often separated from their families for long periods, living in employers' homes under strict supervision. While some found opportunities for skill development and social mobility, many endured isolation, overwork, and exploitation. The social hierarchy within households mirrored wider class divisions, teaching children early lessons about power, obedience, and societal expectations. Legislation slowly began to address child labor during the Victorian era, reflecting a growing concern for welfare and morality. The Factory Acts and Mines Act set limits on working hours, minimum ages, and conditions, but enforcement was inconsistent. Reformers, philanthropists, and educators campaigned for broader protections, linking childhood labor to health, education, and morality. These efforts laid the foundation for modern child labor laws, recognizing that childhood should include education, leisure, and protection from exploitation. Despite the hardships, Victorian children often demonstrated remarkable adaptability. They balanced work, family responsibilities, and occasional leisure, navigating a world of strict expectations and limited choices. Friendships, communal play, and informal learning offered brief respites from labor, allowing children to preserve elements of childhood joy and creativity. These small victories highlighted the resilience, ingenuity, and spirit of young people confronting the realities of industrial life. In conclusion, childhood labor in the Victorian era was a defining element of daily life, shaping social roles, education, and personal development. While harsh, exhausting, and often dangerous, work also fostered practical skills, resilience, and community bonds. The gradual reforms and public awareness that emerged in response to child labor reflected society's evolving understanding of childhood as a protected stage of life, deserving of education, care, and opportunity. By studying this aspect of Victorian childhood, we gain a deeper appreciation for the courage, resourcefulness, and tenacity of children who lived, learned, and grew in a world of immense challenges. As we wrap up our journey through Victorian childhood, today we focus on a topic that offers a lighter, more joyful perspective: play and leisure. After exploring work, schooling, and the many responsibilities children faced, it is important to remember that even in the strict, structured, and sometimes harsh world of the Victorian era, children found ways to play, imagine, and enjoy themselves. Play was not just a pastime, it was a critical part of social development, creativity, and emotional well-being. Victorian childhood play varied widely depending on social class, location, and gender. In wealthier households, children had access to toys, books, games, and outdoor activities. Dolls, miniature tea sets, toy soldiers, and board games like the Mansion of Happiness were common among middle and upper-class children. These toys were not merely for amusement. They were also designed to instill moral lessons, etiquette, and social norms. Girls' play often mirrored domestic roles, preparing them for future responsibilities, while boys engaged with toys that encouraged strategic thinking, construction, or adventure. For working-class children, play was often more improvised, yet no less imaginative. Without access to expensive toys, children created games from everyday objects, using sticks, stones, or scraps of wood. Street games, skipping ropes, marbles, hopscotch, and tag were immensely popular, fostering physical activity, coordination, and social skills. Urban neighborhoods often became playgrounds where children could invent rules, form teams, and negotiate rivalries, all valuable lessons in cooperation, creativity, and conflict resolution. Outdoor play was a vital aspect of Victorian childhood, though the degree to which children could engage in it depended heavily on social class and environment. In rural areas, children had space to run, climb, and explore nature. They climbed trees, swam in rivers, and helped with light farm tasks that often doubled as play, blurring the line between labor and leisure. In crowded industrial cities, however, safe outdoor spaces were limited. Streets and alleys became makeshift playgrounds, and parks, when available, were cherished spaces for relaxation and exercise. Games and play often carried moral or educational undertones. Board games, card games, and parlor games could teach numeracy, literacy, strategy, and social etiquette. Storytelling, recitation, and dramatic play were also common, particularly in middle-class homes. These activities nurtured imagination, memory, and self-expression, serving as early forms of cultural and intellectual education. Even improvisational games in working-class communities often involved creativity and negotiation, reflecting children's ingenuity in less structured environments. Physical play was equally important. Sports, outdoor exercise, and energetic games contributed to children's health, stamina, and social skills. Boys might engage in cricket, football, or skittle games, while girls participated in skipping, dancing, or hoop rolling. These activities built camaraderie, teamwork, and resilience, preparing children for the physical demands of adult life. Schools also encouraged structured sports and drills, promoting both discipline and fitness. Victorian literature and periodicals often reflected children's play, shaping popular culture and expectations. Fairy tales, adventure stories, and moral fables not only entertained but also influenced how children imagined their own games and fantasies. Stories from authors like Lewis Carroll and the Brothers Grimm inspired imaginative play, role-playing, and creative exploration, showing that the boundary between fiction and reality was often a playground for children's minds. While play was crucial, leisure in Victorian childhood also included quieter, Reflective activities. Reading, drawing, music, and craftwork were common pastimes, particularly for middle and upper-class children. These activities encouraged concentration, aesthetic appreciation, and personal expression. Libraries, reading rooms, and children's clubs provided spaces for communal learning and leisure, reflecting society's growing recognition that childhood was not solely a period for labor but also for enrichment and growth. Importantly, play and leisure offered respite from the demands of work and school. For children in harsh labor conditions, brief moments of fun could provide emotional relief, a sense of agency, and opportunities to bond with peers. These experiences underscored the resilience and adaptability of Victorian children, who found joy and creativity even within constrained circumstances. Play was not a luxury, it was essential for psychological development, social learning, and personal identity. The Victorian emphasis on play and leisure also reflected broader societal changes. Reformers and educators began to recognize the value of childhood as a unique stage of life. Organized recreational activities, children's clubs, playgrounds, and youth organizations emerged in the late 19th century, promoting moral development, teamwork, and civic responsibility alongside enjoyment. These initiatives laid the groundwork for modern concepts of child-centered education and recreation, illustrating a shift toward understanding that play is vital to a healthy childhood. In conclusion, play and leisure were indispensable components of Victorian childhood. Whether through structured games, imaginative improvisation, outdoor adventures, or quiet creative pursuits, children found ways to explore, socialize, and grow. Play nurtured physical skills, cognitive development, and emotional resilience, balancing the demands of work, schooling, and social expectation. By examining these activities, we gain insight into the joy, creativity, and ingenuity of Victorian children, reminding us that even in a world of strict rules and responsibilities, the spirit of childhood endured through laughter, games, and imagination. As we reach the end of our journey through the world of Victorian childhood, it is amazing to see just how rich and complex the experience of growing up was during this era. From the challenges of work and education to the joys of play, leisure, and creative exploration, children navigated a world full of rules, expectations, and opportunities. Each aspect of their lives, from strict schooling to imaginative games, tells us something important about society, culture, and the resilience of the human spirit. Victorian children, despite the challenges they faced, found ways to learn, grow, and enjoy their childhood. Their stories remind us that even in times of hardship, curiosity, imagination, and joy can thrive. By understanding the past, we gain insight not only into history but also into the timeless experiences that shaped childhood across generations. Thank you so much for joining me on this journey into Victorian childhood. I hope you found it as fascinating and eye-opening as I did. Do not forget to like, subscribe, and leave a comment sharing your thoughts, maybe even about your favorite childhood games or memories. Until next time, take care and keep exploring the stories that history has to tell.